Hello and welcome to the first session of my members-only question and answers. We've received a very interesting selection of questions, some of them nicely specific, others of them big and roomy. I've only got to hear that word, say that word, and I'm carried back 40 odd years to meetings of the syllabus subcommittee and the Board of Examiners in History of the University of London. And I hear my old colleague S.T. Bindorf, his big, deep voice saying, what we need are roomy questions, questions with room in them. Now, this was actually code that he wanted exam questions to be so vague that his students stood half a chance of answering them without his needing to alter his dog-eared set of lecture notes, which he had been giving without alteration for about the last 50 years. When I describe your questions as being roomy, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that they're big and that they raise big issues. And the one that raised the biggest issue, and the one that most struck my attention, so I'm going to answer it first, is by Simon, who is a Master of Studies student. That degree didn't even exist when I was at Cambridge. He's a Master of Studies student at Cambridge. And he asks a double question with a sort of statement in the middle. The question is partly about my relations with Elton, which he correctly describes as being because it were somewhat tense. Actually, they begin very well. And I owe a vast amount to him, and I learned to do history at his feet, and I will always acknowledge that. But having begun as a kind of favourite son, it is absolutely true, as Simon suggests, that I became anathema. There were even jokes about it at Cambridge. Well, there were rather more than jokes. There were lectures to the effect that I was Geoffrey Elton's Lucifer. Lucifer, the bright star of morning, but of course it's also the anti-hero of Milton's great epic. You have God and you have Lucifer, who he begins as his favourite angel, the favourite son of morning, but through the sin of pride falls and becomes the devil. It has to be said, Lucifer is a much more interesting character than God, but don't tell anybody. Anyway, so Simon begins with talking about my relationship with Elton, and then he points out, this is the assertion correctly, that despite all our agreements, despite all our disputes over specific points, our views of history and how you do history were very, very similar. We both believed in fact, in the primacy, the autonomy of the evidence. And he asked me then to move on a stage and to situate that and myself and my own approaches to history in the dialogue, the argument rather, that was established in the 1960s by two very considerable historians, Elton on the one hand and E.H. Carr on the other, and the two books that they wrote on historiography or the ways of doing history. The first was E.H. Carr's What is History?, written at the beginning of the decade, 1961, and the second was Geoffrey Elton's very different title, The Practice of History, that was written in 1967. And this is what Simon asked by way of a specific question. I wondered how far you were influenced by Elton's approach to historical scholarship generally. His ideas seem very close to your current pushback against woke history and the dispute over historical truth. This debate seems reminiscent of Elton's own argument with E.H. Carr's What is History? Spot on. Look at that date again. Look at the date of 1967. In my career, it's a key moment. That's the year that I finished being an undergraduate. I graduated at Cambridge and I went on and I became one of Geoffrey Elton's research students and a member of his research seminar, which were some of the happiest and the most productive days of my life. The practice of history. History, in other words, isn't something, Geoffrey says, that you theoritise about. It's something that you do, that you learn, not through theory, but through practice. In other words, through a kind of apprenticeship. Well, I suppose in 1967 I had just mastered, I had just completed my apprenticeship with my graduation, and my apprentice master had been Geoffrey himself in his special subject class, which was the moment at which I first learned to think seriously about history, and probably first really began fully to enjoy Cambridge and to realise a bit properly of my own talents. I'd been very confident about them at school. I'd been rather less confident about them at Cambridge. And what was it that made this difference? Well, the special subject paper, no idea whether it's still the same, but the special subject paper then was divided into two separate examination papers. The second of them was a conventional, whatever number it was, of questions to be answered by essays within 3 hours. The first paper was very different. It was to test you on what was rather disgustingly known as gobbets, in other words, things in your gob, between your teeth. In other words, extracts of documents that were pulled out and were there for comment. And the documents were taken from a great dossier which Geoffrey had given to all those of us who were students in that particular class, in that particular subject. And the subject was obviously the reign of Henry VIII. It was what became the book known as The Enforcement of the Henrischen Reformation. That's its subtitle. Its main title is Policy and Police. And it looked at how Henry, and particularly Cromwell, enforced the vast changes of the 1530s. And there was a huge range of documents there. There were proclamations, there were circular letters, there were letters between the minister and his various agents, there were reports from the localities, there were treason trials, there was everything. And one of the things you were learning to do was to date documents, how you dated a document, and also to categorize them, to use what's called diplomatic, that's the common form of documents, to distinguish one kind of document from another. And Geoffrey, of course, offered you indications with clear titles and clear headings. And I can still remember the moment. I've actually forgotten the detail. Was the document a royal proclamation, or was it a circular letter to sheriffs? I can't remember. But Geoffrey had got it wrong. And I pointed out what it really was. There was a... he was short, but very powerfully built man with a very deep down here voice, kind of voice that I always say accounts for the prevalence of prostate cancer in Americans. Anyway, very deep down voice here. But he accepted my correction. At that moment, I thought, I can do this. There's something, isn't there, Simon, symbolic, that my real relationship with Geoffrey, I'm sure, the first time that he distinguished me from all the other undergraduates in the class was a dispute about facts. Because, of course, that's what this whole debate is about. Geoffrey, as I said, in the practice of history, the idea of history as an apprenticeship, me, of course, there as an apprentice, learning how to do it. And on the other hand, the much more theoretical approach taken by E.H. Carr. What's the difference? Well, I think the difference is actually less than it's conventionally supposed to be, but let's just present it in the conventional terms of opposition, apposition between the two of them. Elton, in the full German tradition established by Ranke, the idea of historical fact, the evidence. What do? You construct history by looking at pieces of evidence and trying to make a pattern out of them. And remember, this seems to me to be absolutely the fundamental point. We are pattern-making animals. This is how we understand everything. By narration, which is one pattern, by artistic composition, which is another pattern, by mathematics, which is another pattern, by historical narrative, by fiction, which are other patterns too. the making of historical patterns with historical evidence, which is properly tested, is, it seemed to Elton, and seems to me, the fundamental task of the historian. So that's the Elton position. I think adequately summarised, but Simon, I'd be interested to see whether you agreed with that in the practice of history. What does Carr say? Carr says something rather different. He emphasises the difference between mere historical evidence and a historical fact. A mere historical fact is, well, it's anything. What elevates it to the level of historical evidence is the conscious choice of the historian to incorporate it into his analysis and his narrative. This, of course, in Carr's case, is emphatically Marxist. Carr is writing a history of the Soviet Union from the point of view of a convinced Marxist, and I suppose honestly, a convinced communist. So he sees historical facts as belonging to two different categories. Those that, in a sense, can be discarded, they're unimportant, what we have for breakfast, or, on the other hand, those that contribute towards the understanding of the Marxist theory of history, the notion of class struggle, of class consciousness, of the primacy of economics, and so on. So the historian chooses his information from this heap. Remember, what we have really, isn't it? It's the dunghill of the past. It's the detritus. It's the gigantic waste paper basket of the past. The historian chooses from this, dusts the fragments off, polishes them up, and puts them into the pure gold of a Marxist analysis. So here the emphasis is different. With Elton, it's the raw data. With Carr, it is the data polished, arranged, and given meaning, that very important word, given meaning by a theory, by a theoretical explanation. This position, the primacy of the historian and the primacy of the historian's theory, whether or not it be Marxist or anything else, has enjoyed a great vogue in the latter 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, because of course it does two things. It flatters the historian, and historians like self-flattery. They have a high opinion of themselves, and with the move to professionalisation of history, something which Geoffrey pushed very hard, and with his industry, his organising skills, his drive, he was very influential in doing. The professionalisation of history, of course, requires the historian to assume the kind of mantle of a medical doctor or a lawyer, a profession, subject to its own distinction, rules, structure, and so on. So you can see why the E.H. Carr thing flatters the self-esteem of the historian. There's another way in which I think it's very important, and it's important insidiously. What it enables you to do, and this again chimes in with certain developments in the actual patterns of teaching and prefers methods of teaching. What it does, it emphasizes the importance of the historian as an analytical, as a skills-based profession, analysing documents, weighing them against each other, constructing his, her, their interpretation. And this, of course, chimes in with the fashion for, in schooling, to disregard content, disregard fact, disregard information as being boring, something that you look up, something you can find easily online, and emphasise instead skills. So the idea of the primacy of the historian, the analytical historian, chimes in with the idea of skills. It also fits with a rather profound political agenda, which is to stop teaching history as it always used to be thought of as the broad-based understanding in chronological order of your own civilization, your own country, but also to try to place it in a broader map of time, of human development, of, if you like, of world history. All that's been junked. And the idea is instead that we teach history as merely historical analysis, which is why, in my view, at far too young an age, students are given historical documents, the kind of thing that I was given only as a third year undergraduate, and expected to be able to understand them. Now, a 12 or 13-year-old can't. All they do is they recite formulae which are given them by their teachers. You know, we find that dreadful word, bias. Of course you find bias. Every human utterance is biased, but we learn to cope with it. So the E.H. Carr version, I think, is sort of subversive. But that's things, using Marxist language, that have been built on it as a kind of superstructure. What's really interesting, Simon, I don't know whether you've ever bothered to read E.H. Carr as a historian and compare him with Elton as an historian. E.H. Carr writes a gigantic, I can't remember how many volume history it is, of the Soviet Union, which he finishes more or less as the Soviet Union is collapsing, not incidentally suggesting that he had a terribly good grasp of the direction of history, which of course is the fundamental claim to authority by the Marxist scholar, that they understand the direction of history. You know, to have devoted your life to writing a history of the Soviet Union suggests that your understanding of the direction of history might actually be just a little bit defective. But setting that rather naughty dig aside, just go and read a few pages of Carr. I'm sure you've read Elton, but go back and read Elton. The thing that will strike you is, whatever their theoretical differences, they do history in pretty much the same fashion. It's footnotes, it's documents, it's argument, it's analysis, it's strongly chronological, because actually that's the only damn way you can do it. Yeah? Other than the resort to fiction and imagination and the abstract theory, jarring theories of postmodernism, which we needn't even debate, because postmodernists don't believe in debate and don't believe in reason, so why dignify them by joining with them? Anyway, the emphasis again, with all the theoretical differences, Elton and Carr write pretty much the same kind of history. Even more striking is if you look at Carr's editor. This is the distinguished modern historian, the historian of Germany, Sir Richard Evans. Richard Evans writes a huge study of the Third Reich on the one hand, but the point at which which again is very good, very conventional history, but at the same time he comes to real fame in a trial. The trial of David Irving, the Holocaust denier, that's the fashionable term. I just call him a Nazi apologist. What happens in that trial, Irving is suing for libel. He's suing for libel against somebody who had properly analysed his crimes against history, in other words, the distortion of documents. And the outcome of the trial depended entirely on the evidence of Richard Evans. And what Richard Evans did was to produce a devastating, wonderful, forensic display of fact. He showed repeatedly how Irving had perverted fact, had deliberately introduced error. In other words, from the editor of E.H. Carr, there was a resounding display of pure Rankian, Eltonian, historical positivism, because, as I repeat, that is the only way you can do the subject. Right, that's off my chest. Let's now go backwards and look at the whole question of the disagreement between myself and Elton. Why? Because there isn't really a sheet of paper between us in how we approach history. Why did we have such radical disputes? Well, we had disputes about fact, and when the debate between us climaxed literally in a debate in the historical journal, the magazine, the journal, better word, of the Cambridge History faculty, my answer to his very adverse review of the book that I edited called The English Court was, the title of it was Tudor Government, The Facts. And it began as follows. Now what I want is facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. This is a quotation from fiction, actually. This is Mr. Gradgrind in Hard Times. He's the aggressive utilitarian school inspector in Dickens's book, and as I point out, Mr. Gradgrind, calling for facts and only facts, speaks as confidently for life as Sir Geoffrey Elton does for history. And what I then did was trade fact for fact with him and prove that Elton was wrong, and that Elton's claims for, as he understood it, a Tudor revolution in government were wrong. Just to recap quickly, I'm sure Simon knows, but just to make sure we're all up to speed, what did Elton mean by a Tudor revolution in government? Well, I've talked about it before, so let's summarise it very quickly. It's an idea which is dangerously borrowed from sociology. It's also a phrase which doesn't actually appear in Elton's own very distinguished thesis on the administrative courts and whatever that Thomas Cromwell set up in the 1530s. The phrase is actually borrowed from a very odd old-fashioned essay by a man called one of Elton's predecessors at the University of London at King's College, a man called A.P. Newton, and it's actually about Wolsey's reforms in government, where he claims there was a revolution in government and the invention of a new sort of bureaucracy. And all Geoffrey did, I'm ashamed to say, was clamp A.P. Newton's phrase on his own research when he published it as a book, Naughty Naughty. This is the bed of Procrustes, when you take information and you stretch it and you squeeze it to fit the phrase or to fit the theory. But the bigger idea behind the Tudor revolution in government was sociological. It's German. It comes from the work of the German sociologist Max Weber, who argues that forms of government shift from intensely personal and charismatic, the rule of a king, a warrior leader, a priest or whatever, to what he called the bureaucratic, which are depersonalized forms of civil service administration with committees, minutes, rules and all the rest of it. So that's roughly what Elton claims happens. Of course, there's a great problem about seeing this revolution put in that sense. In other words, as it were, the dethroning of the personal authority of the monarch in favour of committees, presumably the Privy Council, in terms of clerkly individuals, royal secretaries, ministers, and so on. There is a profound difficulty of this view wherever it falls in the reign of Henry VIII, whether it falls earlier under Wolsey, according to Newton, or whether it falls later, according to Elton under Cromwell, which is that it happens under Henry VIII, who has to be the king who is most kingly in English history. Not the best king, but the most kingly king, the one whose assertion of the absoluteness of royal power was most vehement, whose grasp on that was firmest, whose nails are dug into the flesh of power, which he will not give up. I used to tease Geoffrey. He began by taking it well and took it less and less well as time went on. When exactly did Thomas Cromwell explain to Henry that he was redundant, that he'd been superseded by this new fashionable modern form of bureaucratic government? And the answer, as we all know, is about 5 minutes before he is executed by a deliberately inexperienced executioner, presumably with a specially blunted axe. Anyway, all good fun, but making a really solid point. So how did Geoffrey get it so wrong? Well, I think this takes us to another problem. The problem seems to me not the question of whether sources are important. Of course sources are important. You have no other way of doing history, as I said, apart from writing stuff out of your imagination, in which case it has a different name. It's called fiction. The question is your choice of sources, the range of sources that you use. And Geoffrey wrote about this quite a lot, as he did about many other things. I've no idea, Simon, whether you've actually looked at his essay on the choice of sources, particularly the choice of sources for administrative history. And what he does in that essay, he draws up a hierarchy of sources. In other words, the sources aren't born free and equal. Sources are ranked in terms of those which are more trustworthy, that the historian should adhere to, and those which are least trustworthy. At the top, Geoffrey puts the official, the actual documents produced by official government organs like the Privy Council, like the courts, like the Exchequer. Next are comments within other official documents on the goings-on in official bodies, and then right at the bottom is the general stuff that, say, ambassadors or ordinary people or literature may actually say about such things. So you've got this hierarchy of the official, as it were, the internal record of an institution, then the general operations of the government machine, and finally, if you like, the word on the street, or the word in the embassy, or the word in the palace. At first sight, it looks quite convincing. But you know, there's an absolutely fundamental problem. It is that the record sources of institutions are indeed, I think, most of the time, trustworthy. But what do the words in them actually mean? Because, of course, words change their meaning over time. This is one of the reasons why most postmodernists argue that the past is utterly unknowable, because it's the other. It is indeed another country, and apparently we can't understand that other country. Actually, that simply seems to me to be a general problem of human communication. How does one human being with his world inside his head communicate with another human being whose world is inside his head? Well, actually, most of the time in real life, we cope pretty well. And I think with a degree of tact, of understanding, and of range, we can actually accommodate that same question of understanding across time very well. It's another historian who comes up with the phrase that I've always been most impressed by. It is the phrase of the American historian J.H. Hexter, who says the historian must have two presents. You must try to inhabit two different times, your own, which you do without effort, and the time which you study. And you must try and develop the same degree of instinctive understanding of that past time that you do of your own. And of course, think about it, Simon, everybody else. You don't develop that instinctive understanding only by reading official documents, even if you're a politician, even if you are a civil servant. You develop it by your education, by your conversation, by your reading of literature, your knowledge of art, your knowledge of the whole range of human activity. And the other phrase, of course, is the one that the French sometimes use, histoire totale, the history of everything. And this has another very important point, or there is a very important point here. So far, we've been talking about history entirely as words. The words of historical evidence, the written record of the past, which indeed is the essential dividing line between archaeology and prehistory and history. It is the survival of written evidence, the primacy of the word, and the primacy of the word, again, of course, in how we talk about it, how we write about it, through the medium of language. But words aren't everything. Words only matter, in my view, because they relate to an external reality. Otherwise, they are the mere flashing of electrons in the head, nothing more than that. How can we grasp the external reality of the past? We live it in our own times. We touch it, we feel it, we look at it. We look at the lights, we look at the rooms, we look at the colours, we smell, we hear the buzzing of the fly, we look at the carpet, we look at the dust in the corner. We have this sense, we sit on the chair, we feel the cushion. We have this sense of materiality. That word, materiality, physicality. This seems to me to be what the historian, although of course you have the primacy of language, the historian has to do everything he can to restore that sense of the materiality of the past, the physical environment of the past. This is why I became a court historian. I wanted to understand a world, a place. I understood that power was indeed in a person, the king, but that king, the king, was in a place. He was in a palace. He moved between palaces. Within the palace, he was in specific rooms, and they were furnished in particular ways, and there were particular rules governing access to them. He walked to a chapel where he sat in a particular place and heard particular music and did particular things, and came in touch with vestments, and came in touch with incense and gold and frankincense and myrrh and everything else. That physical world. And this is why, repeatedly, in my own scholarship, I've been engaged in exhibitions, historical exhibitions, which have brought together the material survivals of the world. And again, the great project which I launched with the Society of Antiquaries, from which I was spat out last year, the project to publish the inventories of Henry VIII, the extraordinary list of the king's possessions, which was drawn up at the time of Henry VIII's death, in the immediate aftermath of Henry VIII's death, because all these possessions, these hundreds of thousands of things that this most acquisitive of English kings had accumulated, were all to be handed over to his son, who was a minor, so they had to be accounted for. You had the equivalent of a gigantic probate inventory, and I organised and edited the publication of that, which has been carried on wonderfully by my former research student, now Professor Maria Haywood, with very great distinction. So why does this matter? What on earth does this have to do with my dispute with Elton? Let me just give you the simplest of examples. In this, the Tudor government, the facts. One of the central debates was about the central organ, as Geoffrey saw it, of the Tudor revolution in government, the Privy Council, which he claimed was created by Thomas Cromwell, though in fact it is perfectly clear the creation of the Privy Council is a direct outcome of Cromwell's fall. In fact, the whole reign of Henry VIII is really an oscillation between rule by a single chief minister under the king and the collective rule of a council under the king. And the emergence of the formal Privy Council follows Cromwell's fall, and Henry VIII himself very definitely assuming direct charge of government. The question is, where does the council belong? Does it belong to Elton's world of bureaucracy, of the formalised structures of government that exist over and against the king, or does it belong within the world of charismatic royal authority? Elton, of course, insists that it is bureaucratic. I insist that the council, because it is a direct emanation, it's a direct instrument of the king's sovereignty, actually belongs in that charismatic world. Now, that sounds like it is indeed a highly theoretical set of statements. How on earth can you possibly decide which it is? Well then, Simon, it's very easy. It's not answered by the documents. It's certainly not answered by the records of the Privy Council. But do you know what? It is answered absolutely certainly by architecture and by geography and by the town planning of Westminster. Because in Westminster there are two palaces. After 1513, the king never lives in the old Palace of Westminster. That is what we now call, much rebuilt of course, the Houses of Parliament, with the Great Hall and then the Victorian structure erected by with the architect Barry and decorated by Pugin, magnificent structures of the present Houses of Parliament. And in 1513, why that date? Well, the private part of that palace, the portion of the palace where actually the southern portion of the palace where the king had lived and in fact invariably stayed pretty much from the Norman conquest in the winter months, because remember, government isn't only a place, it's also a time. It essentially only happens in winter. In the summer, the king goes on progress. And there is that wonderful phrase in Edward Hall's chronicle at one point, nothing happened this summer because the king went hunting. Anyway, in winter, the king was in the Palace of Westminster at one end of the palace, and the Parliament met at the other end of the palace, and within various sections of the Great Hall were the law courts, the Exchequer, and later on added under Cromwell things like the Court of Augmentations and so on. In other words, the judicial instruments of government and the formal administrative governments, and there was also the Star Chamber, roughly where the present Speaker's House now is. There was the Star Chamber where the council met as both an advisory council and as a judicial council that we call the Star Chamber. From 1513, the private section of the palace burns out, but all the rest of those things that I've described, the Parliament, the law courts, the administration, the council, at least in its judicial capacity, they all continue within the Palace of Westminster, the old Palace of Westminster. But where was the king? Well, after 1513, Henry spends most of his time, when he has to be in the vicinity of London, he spends it in the lovely riverside Palace of Greenwich, and he commutes by boat to Westminster when he had to. And there were also a few experiments of creating town palaces like Bridewell, that was linked to the great monastery of Blackfriars by a sort of bridge of sighs and so on, but they are abandoned at the time of Henry's trial, the trial of Henry's divorce in 1529, because the king experiences the vehement hostility of the city of London and the citizens rather of London to his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and their fervent devotion to Catherine, and the fact you've got the open bridge of sighs connecting the palace Bridewell to the monastery Blackfriars, where the actual trial before Cardinal Campeggio and Cardinal Wolsey of Henry's marriage takes place. The fact that the bridge is open means that the citizens can express their support for Catherine, cheering vigorously, and their detestation of Henry by booing loudly. So Henry abandons the city of London at that point. But instead, of course, the fall of Wolsey that follows from the catastrophe of that trial gives Henry a new great palace in Westminster, what we call the Palace of Whitehall, that was originally York Place. It was Wolsey's townhouse as Archbishop of York, which he'd rebuilt on a gigantic scale. Henry confiscates it together with all his grand possessions, and he rebuilds it on an even bigger scale as the Palace of Whitehall. Where does the council meet? if you actually look, as Geoffrey pointed out vehemently there, all the council records say it meets in Westminster, in the old palace, nowhere near, that is to say, the king and the Privy Chamber and whatever, who are in the new palace of Whitehall. Geoffrey then just says, "Got you, Starkey. Can't even read the documents." Well, you see, I was able to say something rather devastating. Elton simply did not understand the basic language that was used for the palaces, the royal palaces. He did not understand their geography, and he did not understand their function. Because in 1536, an Act of Parliament was passed, which incorporated the remains of the old Palace of Westminster into the new palace, which we call Whitehall, but they hardly ever did, and declared that the whole was the Palace of Westminster. And then I found the evidence which shows that the council meets, well, you'd expect it. Why is it called privy? It actually meets next to the king's bedroom in the Palace of Whitehall, but in official language called Westminster. Even more staggeringly, where does the Secretary of State, this key bureaucrat that Elton saw as being the heralder of new times, where does he have his office? Well, in the King's study. And where is the King's study? It's right next to the royal bedroom. And you have William Paget, the holder of this office, writing to the two heads of the Privy Chamber, the equivalent of the Downing Street staff, the inner members, the heads of the inmost royal household, to Henrich and Denny, saying, this is impossible. I can't have my clerks using the King's study. This wonderful phrase, for fear of diseasing his majesty. This doesn't mean infecting him. It means the king's trying to sleep next door when the clerks who are dealing with an emergency have to come and go right through the night. And Paget uses this most wonderful phrase, I've got nowhere to put my table. You can't have a bureaucracy without a desk table. So what we've got to understand is Elton failed to understand the 16th century because he failed to understand not its documents, but its material, physical culture. And it's that material, physical culture which actually conditions the meaning of the words. The words, the Palace of Westminster, can't be determined from documents alone. The Palace of Westminster is a place. It's determined by archaeology and, in fact, by legislation, which defines it. We need, in other words, a different approach to sources. We need that sense of the Catholicity, that willingness to immerse yourself in the history of everything, of music, of dress, of furniture, of agriculture, of gardening, of everything. History, total, histoire, total history, histoire totale, the historian's two presents. That, Simon, seems to me to be the way forward. I'm sorry, that was a very long answer to your question. Your fault for asking it. It made me think, and I hope I carried you with my thoughts. Thank you.